Today, the degradation of global freshwater resources affects billions around the world. More than 2 billion people continue to lack access to safely managed drinking water, and at least half the world's global population must contend with highly water-stressed conditions for a significant portion of the year. At the same time, climate change, demographic change, and conflict all have diverse and unpredictable consequences for water security. The world's ability to anticipate and react to the threats of the global water crisis will be dictated in part by the collective capacity to turn information into policy, into action. Hello and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies on this World Water Day, March 22nd. I'm Zane Swanson, Fellow with the Global Food and Water Security Program at CSIS here in Washington, D.C., and I'm joined by my colleague and Senior Fellow for Water Security, David Mickle, as we discuss some of the most important developments in the ways in which we measure and understand water security around the world, and what these developments mean for global water security strategies generally, and for the theme of this year's World Water Day, leveraging water for peace, more specifically. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Sarah Young, who's joining us remotely from Cambridge in the UK. Dr. Young is a senior non-resident associate of our program and is an associate professor of anthropology and global health at Northwestern University, and is a Leverhulme visiting professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Dr. Young has led efforts to develop the Water Insecurity Experiences scales, or the WISE scales, which are cross-culturally equivalent tools for quantifying household and individual experiences of water insecurity. Significantly, today's event marks the release of nationally representative data from 40 low, middle, and high-income countries from around the world, with these data being made public for the very first time. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. David, as we get into our discussion, I'd like to ask you to briefly reflect on the theme of this year's World Water Day and how we can endeavor to sustain or even generate peace through water security.
The theme of this year's World Water Day is leveraging water for peace. Water is essential to human well-being and prosperity for drinking and cooking, for agricultural production, food resources, but also for economic development and livelihoods. In high-income countries, 50% of all jobs depend on water resources. In lower-income countries, up to 80% of jobs depend on water resources. So that when lack of clean, safe water undermines those livelihoods, undermines that employment, it can disrupt social cohesion, generate tensions and grievances that might contribute to political conflicts. So the connections between water and peace are increasingly clear. We can see this, for example, in Nigeria, where oil development has contaminated the waters of the Niger River Delta in coastal regions. And there, insurgents militating against the Nigerian government claim that the poisoning of their water resources is one of the reasons for their combat against the state. So in supporting the development of water resources availability, access, quality, we're supporting human development and prosperity, and therefore underlying development and promotion of peace. And one of the values of the WISE scale data is that we can see the ingredients of that development and the ingredients of peace in the information that this scale enables us to unpack.
Great, yeah. A lot there in terms of the ways in which water is related to development, but also the ways in which we need to leverage our understanding of water security in order to help efforts to continue to develop countries around the world. Sarah, with David making this point, where do you see the current state of water security research, and what do you see as its impact on global policy?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a pleasure to be here. So on one hand, I would say that there's momentum now for research in water security. I mean, the UN water meeting in New York last year marked a milestone for the world's attention on water. And we see interest in water not only from the water sector, but also multi-sectoral. So the food sector is seeing we need water for food. We need water for peace, to your point, David. But I would also say there's an acknowledged data gap. I mean, in 2018, the UN the high-level panel for water acknowledged that we need water. We can't manage what we don't measure, and there are some big gaps in our understanding of water.
Perfect. We are going to be chatting a lot about data, about water, data that you've been producing for nearly a decade. But before we get into sort of the key insights from the release of those data, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the WISE scales, the Water Insecurity Experiences scales themselves, and wonder if you could speak about their inception and the collaborations you've been able to build as you've implemented them in, I think, 55 plus countries around the world now.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, I mean, water came to me. I didn't really come to water. I'm trained in nutrition, but in field work, to tell you how this happened, I have to take you back 10 years, where it became very clear that there was something happening that we weren't measuring. So I was doing field work in Kenya, and I was paying attention to food. But what women were telling me was that water was a fundamental problem. So as a baby assistant professor, I thought, well, let me just measure all of the things. How is water being measured? And it turns out there are lots of ways that water is being measured. We're good at measuring physical indicators of water. We're good at measuring contamination. But the stories that people were telling me they weren't suffering from the availability. As an example, there was a woman who, very pregnant, she wasn't able to get the water that was coming to her homestead. So she had to go far away to fetch the water and went into premature labor. Measuring the infrastructure of her household, measuring the number of cubic meters in Kenya didn't capture her voice. So I turned to see how other people had been measuring it. There were great indicators for kind of country-specific places. It was a great measure for Bolivia, a great measure for Ethiopia, but they weren't appropriate for Kenya. So we sort of, from the ground up, built something that was appropriate for use in Kenya, and anthropologists love comparative work. We then took it this was a team of dozens and dozens of great anthropologists and epidemiologists and geographers working together for several years to come up with these 12 magical questions that you're seeing here. I'll spare you the statistics and the blood and the sweat and the tears, but we sort of landed on those through many years of work, and that's what the Water Insecurity Experiences scales are.
Great, and I was actually one of those fortunate anthropologists who was able to use this tool before I really knew what it was. And I was lucky enough to use it during field work in Kenya. And it really changed the way that I thought of water security, because naively, as an evolutionary anthropologist, I just understood it as either a vessel for waterborne illness or the scarcity of it leading to differences in behavior, migration, agricultural practices changing. But really adding this experiential aspect to it helped me unpack what water security is when it manifests within an individual, within a household, within a community. Any insights into what it unpacked for you as we look at these 12 items, which also consist of the 12 different components of the survey?
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point. The term water security is a term that covers all manner of sins. I mean, sometimes water security is used to mean drought. Sometimes it means water contamination. Sometimes it means water stress, like how much how much of a country's water is being used compared to what their resources are. When we're talking about water security in terms of of experiential measures, we're talking about how water manifests in people's lives. We're talking about people having access to water for their basic uses and in a reliable way. And we have identified these 12 experiences, they take 3 minutes to ask, that really capture what it is to be water secure or water insecure.
So, Sarah, I'd like to dig in a little bit to the those experiences of water security and contrast the types of water security data to which we're habituated, so per capita water availability at the national level, or water withdrawals to renewable resources at the basin level. And here we're really looking down at the household and the individual level, and not only seeing those physical factors like has your water service been interrupted, or have there been periods when you have had no water, but these psychosocial variables, like have you felt shame, or have you been angry about your water situation, or have you been worried about your water access? And to have these at this level of resolution, what does this type of information enable communities, decision makers, policymakers to see and then to do to promote water security?
Yeah, thanks for that. So the WISE scales complement existing indicators. There's every reason to really value information about the physical availability of water. The JMP does a great job tracking drinking water infrastructure access with the drinking water ladder. That's really valuable. But that doesn't tell us the whole picture. What we're getting at here with the WISE scales is a little bit more holistic, because we get information about drinking, as well as about hygiene, as well as about, as you mentioned, the psychosocial burdens. The other thing that the WISE scales can do is give information at a little bit higher resolution, because we can measure at the level of the individual. So we would be remiss to think that water is distributed equally within a household. Not everyone gets the same amount of water of the same quality. Sometimes it happens, but sometimes not. So what the WISE scales do is give us a more holistic, but also higher resolution picture.
Another thing that I find valuable in this type of data is the way that it can be cross-referenced with some of those other stores of knowledge that you alluded to, so that we can cross-reference water insecurity with food insecurity and see how water insecurity impacts food insecurity. Or we can geolocate the communities or the households or the individuals experiencing water insecurity and overlay data on climate change impacts, for example, to see how floods or droughts are impacting water insecurity. So I think that there's a great intersection of data and knowledge that these statistics enable.
Well, thanks. I mean, what I hope for these data to do are to bridge sectors. So, I mean, water security is a value in and of itself. It has intrinsic value. We want that because we want water security. However, thinking of myself 10 years ago, I wasn't paying attention to water. I wasn't paying attention to it all. I was thinking about food. But what we can do with these data, and what we have done with these data, is to use them to bridge the food and water sectors. So with these Gallup data that we'll be talking about in a little bit, we collected these data in the same, Gallup, thank you, Gallup, collected these data in the same individuals. So we have IWISE data in the same individuals, as well as the Food Insecurity Experiences scale in the same individuals. That's extremely powerful, because what we can do is we can control for all the other things that we know shape food insecurity, and really apportion the role that water insecurity plays in food insecurity. And our data show, if you are water insecure, you're 2 to 3 times as likely to be moderate to severely food insecure. Put another way, you can't care about food insecurity without caring about water insecurity. And I love to bind the sectors together. That's what I'm hoping for here.
Yeah, and integration of the physical variables or data and the experiential data. So one thing that struck me is through this questionnaire, for example, you could see in a community where a water utility had expanded service, or new wells had been dug, for example, but yet households and individuals might still be experiencing interruptions to their water service, or they might still be worried about access to water. So you can illuminate how development programming or other interventions are impacting and being reflected at the household and individual level.
That's exactly right. And it's for that reason a number of NGOs are starting to make the HWISE or the IWISE scales as a key performance indicator. Sort of big shout out to Oxfam and Helvetis and now Charity Water, who have all sort of folded this into their monitoring and evaluation to really show more powerfully than say like, well, and now we have 3 boreholes in this village where we didn't before. We can say like, now this many percent, or this proportion smaller are not water insecure anymore. Or look, we've done this intervention. Everyone has infrastructure, but we're still having difficulty with laundry.
So I think this is a great time to actually dive into the data and dive into the infographic that we're able to use based on the data collected by Gallup, which you alluded to, and also to highlight the ways in which these relationships to other sectors exist, as both of you had mentioned, but also sort of the ways in which a more holistic and more precise version of water security data allows us to disaggregate really important covariates to understand who is being left behind or who is not having proper access to water across those 4 pillars of accessibility, quality, stability, and availability. So here is our lovely infographic that we were able to work with the CSIS iLab on. I would be remiss to not mention Fabio Murgia, who's worked very hard on this and made it look very pretty. As we dive into this, I just want to orient all the viewers as to what exactly they're looking at. So as I mentioned up top, there are 40 countries for whom data are being released. You have an amazing impact report that's forthcoming, an event on the 27th, which I'll mention again at the end of this so everybody can keep that on their schedule. But here we're looking at water insecurity as a prevalence of moderate to high water insecurity measured by the WISE scale, the IWISE scale specifically for most of these countries, which is the individual version of the survey. And we also have superimposed an estimated size of the water insecure population. So as a measure of the percent that are moderately to highly water insecure in that country as a nationally representative total by the country population. And so what we see here is not only disparities in water insecurity, but also disparities in the population sizes that are experiencing water insecurity. And I want to be able to attach these to a development lens to tie this back to World Water Day. And when we're talking about water for peace or leveraging water for peace, how do we integrate water security within these other sectors, be it food, be it energy, as we understand trends around the world changing? And so there's a great quote from your forthcoming impact report from Dean Carlin, the agency chief economist at USAID, who says, "A better understanding of water insecurity gives us better knowledge to address poverty." But it's not just poverty, of course, it's also food insecurity, it's urbanicity, and we'll dive into that a bit. So one of the opportunities we have is to look at gender disparities, one of the biggest covariates that are always of interest. And so, Sarah, for you, is there any example of gender results when it comes to the WISE scales that you find particularly interesting, striking, surprising?
Yeah, so the IWISE scales were one of the first sort of large-scale opportunities to look at differences in water and gender. The only other one I know about is some data on who carries water, and what we know from those data are that women are not always, but almost always responsible for fetching water, and they spend hours and hours, and it adds up to billions of hours that women are spending every day getting water for the household. What is the experience of water insecurity in the household? That hasn't been measured up until now. And so you can see these data both here as well as in the JMP gender and 2023 report on gender that came out this summer, that in some places women are much more water insecure than men. However, but elsewhere, men are more water insecure than women. And that was very surprising. I mean, we sort of assume water is a women's issue, and it is a women's issue. But I would say it's not only a women's issue.
Exactly. So I'm pulling up for viewers at home what capability this infographic has. Not only does it show some high-level information about water insecurity from different thresholds, be it no to marginal, low, moderate, or high water insecurity, but it also gives access to one-pagers on each of these countries, which I encourage you to investigate further. But here's an example: Cameroon, who among the countries that were surveyed is the most water insecure, with nearly 64% experiencing moderate to severe water insecurity. And we can see that it follows trends that we would expect, where many more women are reporting moderate or high water insecurity than men. Here we have nearly 45% reporting moderate, and nearly 13% of women reporting really high levels of water insecurity, but significantly fewer men. I'll quickly navigate over to a different example, though. Just on the other side of the African continent, we can look at Ethiopia, where, interestingly, if I can zoom properly, we sort of have this opposite effect going on. And one thing that struck me from reading the impact report, which is to be published, is looking at a regression, a one-to-one of water insecurity among men and among women, and how when you pool across region or pool overall, a lot of these differences collapse, and that may be picked up later on in differences between the specific items within those surveys. But really, this allows us a tool to not just generalize, but have a really nuanced look within communities and within countries, and formulate our plans for development or water security strategies accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, heterogeneity across countries, but even within countries is really different depending on how you get your water and what you need water for. And I'd like to make a point that Bethany Caruso pointed out to me a number of years back, and it's a good reminder for all of us, is that for you and me, Zane, to be exposed to the same level of water insecurity doesn't necessarily mean it will have the same consequences for us. If expectations are that for me, I'm supposed to keep our children clean, I'm supposed to feed my children, I'm supposed to do all these things that involve water, it can be much more of a burden for me to have let's say, an IY score of 12 than for you to.
Sarah, one of the other breakdowns that the data enables us to perceive and to visualize is the rural-urban breakdown. And typically we often think of rural areas as being more likely to suffer from water insecurity, be it from lack of infrastructure or lack of financial resources to fund water services. But in some countries, some communities, it's actually urban populations that have the higher water insecurity scores. I'm thinking, for example, of Mexico, where the most water insecure populations were low-income urban populations. And this is interesting not only from a water service perspective, but from a forward-looking water delivery, water infrastructure, water policy-making perspective, is that policymakers, decision-makers in Mexico are able to use the identification of this type of disparity as a resource for designing programming and designing policies.
That's a great point. I mean, this is another example of where we know that, like with gender, like we know women have the bigger problem. We know the problems are bigger in urban settings. Well, maybe we don't. Maybe what we are assuming isn't correct. And this is another place where seeing what the infrastructure looks like doesn't tell us the whole picture. It was a big honor back in July of this year to be invited to the governor's palace in Nuevo León. So that's a state in the north of Mexico, where they have huge water problems. They're much more water insecure in that particular state than the rest of the country. But they're also an extremely proactive government, where what they've done is saying, like, we need to get ahead of this problem. So they've integrated the HY scale into their poverty alleviation programs. So they're seeing where people are experiencing water insecurity, and they know how to intervene. That they know where to intervene. So it's very useful. It's policy relevant information for avoiding another crisis.
Well, along those lines, through the accumulation of the data and also over time, I imagine that this type of information can also heighten the predictive power of our modeling, of our policy understandings, that where we see water insecurity at the household, at the individual level, and where we see different measures of that water insecurity. So service interruptions, for example, or that correlation between food insecurity and water insecurity that you mentioned earlier, that we can apply this knowledge to forecasting or predictive analysis of where water insecurity may be aggravated or where it might have follow-on societal consequences if populations are increasingly worried or angry about their water situations.
David, I think you're exactly right with that. And this points to something that I feel is really missing, which is longitudinal data for the world. I mean, we are seeing really strong relationships when we have data within a community, within a state, and even within a country. But we need to understand how all of these interact across time. And if we value water, we should be measuring it. I mean, food insecurity, we measure that every year and track progress and report it in the State of the World's Food Insecurity and Nutrition Report. There's every reason to be measuring experiences in the same way so that we get ahead of some of these really major trends. I mean, Zane, you've been talking about mega trends. Like, this is key information to predict all kinds of outcomes. I'm really looking forward to finding a way forward with Gallup to get nationally representative data for all 140 countries in 2024.
Well, in returning for a moment to the World Water Day theme of Water for Peace, I think that the policy impact report that will be coming out next week actually demonstrates part of this predictive power along this theme of Water for Peace, and that there's a study of, I think, 9 African countries where heightened water insecurity was associated with greater levels of conflict, both within the household, but also outside of the household. So that I'm looking forward to further analysis exploring ways in which this type of data can be applied to peace building activities, and particularly because of the granularity, the resolution of the data down at the individual and household level, that increasingly across development interventions, development programming, but also peace building interventions, whether it be within conflict-affected countries or countries, communities coming out of conflict. There's an increasing focus on engaging at the local, at the community level, ensuring that engagements are participatory, taking into account the interests and the experiences of the communities impacted by conflict and affected by the peace-building initiatives. And here we have data that's at the corresponding scale for building that community resilience and promoting peace at the community and the local level.
And what we've seen in Australia is that community members are very comfortable using these kind of questions. The questions are direct and understandable. You don't need a PhD in anthropology to understand the concept of being angry over your water situation. And so when people are using this in and of themselves to change their own communities, that's powerful.
Exactly. And while our time is running short, and I want to be sure to give you, Sarah, a last word on your data and the efforts that you've led, I'm reminded of a conversation that we had about people acting on their experiences. They don't act on the knowledge that, or just the abstract information about water scarcity. They act on what they experience in their life. Do they have access to water? Can they cook food in the water and feel confident in that water? Can they bathe in it and not worry about getting sick or passing that illness on to their child? And so in thinking about the way that we can leverage water for peace, we need to think about the ways in which experiences drive behaviors. So Sarah, with that, any final words before we unfortunately have to go? We can talk about data all day long, I'm sure, but.
Well, I'd like to just thank all the collaborators and all the people who I've worked with over the last decade to make this happen. This is certainly not an individual endeavor. And I think the impact, if there's one thing I can leave people with, it's to think about water security differently, to think about water as people feeling good about the water that they have for basic needs, because that is what will drive our behavior and our world.
Great. Any final words, David?
No, just to thank you and the team for the development of this resource, and to invite the viewers to join in when the data sets for 40 more countries will be launched next week in London.
Exactly. And so right now, as we wrap up, I want to first thank you all for being here. If you're interested in learning more about the data presented here, there are links on the event page below, both to the infographic, but also to the country-specific publications that we've been talking about, the one-pagers. We also have a link to a video that David produced in collaboration with our iLab for World Water Day, titled "What is Water Diplomacy and What Can It Do?" I encourage you all to view that. The link can also be found on the CSIS YouTube page or at the Project for Water Security page on csis.org. Additionally, the official global launch for the WiseScale's Impact Report will be taking place Wednesday, March 27th at the Gallup headquarters in London in the Shard at 3 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, DC time. More information and a link to register for that event can be found below this video on the event page. I highly encourage everybody to join. It's the culmination of nearly a decade of work. You'll hear from Sarah again, as well as a number of other experts operating in the water security space. It'll be a great event, so tune in for that. With this, I want to thank David for being here. I want to thank Dr. Sarah Young for being here and for being an affiliate of our program. I want to thank the Global Food and Water Security Program members, including Emma Dodd, Anitha Kirschenbaum, Lucy Terry, and of course our director, Caitlin Welsh. Thank you to CSIS iLab, and in particular Fabio Murgia for his collaboration and expertise in creating the infographic that we have available for you. Of course, thank you to our amazing external relations and streaming and broadcasting team, Chi Yu, Dinesh Matani, Alex Brunner, Dwayne Gladden, and Tori Blakeney. And then also, I need to acknowledge that this event was produced by the CSIS Project on Water Security, which is supported by the generosity of CSIS trustee Henrietta Fore. Thank you for joining us.